there's a strange mystery behind how Spanish works. In previous videos, we made a comparison to how Spanish and Italian respectively adopted the initial consonant clusters inherited from Latin, and what I essentially argued in that video was that Spanish tended overall to be more conservative. And the examples that I used were things like how the Latin adjective clarus became claro in Spanish, but became chiaro or chiara in Italian. The Latin platea was plaza in Spanish, but piazza in Italian. Even the word for a flower, flos in Latin, is a flor in Spanish, but a fiore in Italian. But it turns out that that was maybe only half of the story. And to get what I'm going on about here, I want you to look at this comparison and see if you can notice a particular pattern. The Latin word for the act of weeping is planctus. In Italian, it's pianto, but in Spanish, llanto. To rain in modern Italian is piovere, and in Spanish, it's llover. A flame, from Latin flamma, is fiamma in Italian, and llama in Spanish. Keys, claves in Latin, are chiave in Italian, but llaves in Spanish. Planus, for a flat territory, is piano in Italian, but llano in Spanish. So what's going on here? If you've been able to identify a pattern, hold on to that, because that's what we're going to talk about in this video. As we mentioned in a previous video, when Italian confronts these particular consonant clusters, and the consonant clusters that we're talking about are the Latin consonant clusters that either have the unvoiced plosives k and p, or the fricative f followed by an l, or to use the specific term, a lateral alveolar proximant, pl, ful, kl, clavis, flos, planta. And what Italian does in that case is Italian tends to go on the path of palatalization. That is to say, it lifts the sound more to the top of the mouth. Planta becomes pianta. Flamma becomes fiamma. Now, we looked at that beforehand, but Spanish is a little bit different. Spanish is a little bit more strange because it's not entirely as consistent as Italian is. And to understand why, I think we need to go all the way back to Latin. In Latin, a lot of these crucial words that are adopted by Spanish and Italian were pronounced with very clear initial consonant clusters. Clarus, flamma, clavis, piovere, planctus. These are what we might consider quite stable initial consonant clusters or onset clusters. There are voiceless stops, k, p, or fricatives, f, followed by this l, this lateral approximant sound that we've looked at just earlier. But the important thing to understand is that the classical Latin that is codified in works like Virgil's Aeneid was not always the Latin that was spoken univocally across the empire. And what is more, it changed over time. Now, as we move towards the fall of the Western Roman Empire, we can see some considerable changes. The resources that I've consulted indicate that towards the beginning of what we might consider the Middle Ages and towards the end of what we might consider the classical period, already this lateral approximant l sound was starting to undergo a secondary palatal articulation. Now, a secondary palatal articulation is something that occurs when an initial, what we might want to consider simple sound, the primary palatal articulation, takes on some kind of new characteristic. So, for example, the p sound in planta in Latin might take on a new kind of characteristic. Moving from p, it might become something like plie. And this seems to have been a widespread early Romance, late classical sound. That is to say, clusters like p, f, cl were actually becoming something a little bit more like plie, clear, flir. And that's crucial to understanding how Italian and Spanish evolved the modern nouns and adjectives that we associate with them today. What is more, this actually seems to be a pretty widespread phenomenon, at least in the Western Roman Empire. Speakers of Romanian might be able to enlighten me as to how this developed in the eastern parts of the empire, but at very least, as the Western Roman Empire was falling into some degree of political decay, we can actually identify this secondary palatal articulation. And this is something that's universal. It universally seems to apply across the Romance languages. Maybe there are some exceptions that you can comment down below. But for the purposes of this story, this narrative, it's an important phenomenon to take account of. In some instances, Italian tended to be a little bit more conservative than Iberian Romance. This secondary articulation, pl, cl, fl, tended to move towards total palatalization. That is to say that l, that lateral approximant sound, completely disappears in favor of an I sound. Pianta from planta, fiamma from flamma. Iberian Romance, however, seems to be a different kettle of fish. Somewhere in the transition from late Latin to early modern Castilian, we see these initial consonant clusters undergo total coalescence. That is to say, that secondary movement, that l sound, dominates the entire initial consonant cluster. We lose that initial consonant. For example, planctus, the noun for the act of weeping, becomes llanto. Piovere, to rain, becomes llover. Flamma becomes llama. And clavis becomes llave. Over time in Spanish, this became entrenched and was represented by a double L symbol. And of course, this is an important time for me to mention that the way that orthographic double L symbol is pronounced does change across the Hispanic world. If you look at Argentina, speakers of Spanish would probably say something a little bit more like shanto. Forgive me for my pronunciation, but there's a very different sound compared to the more commonplace y sound. Some Spanish speakers even insist that we should conserve the ll, the secondary palatal development from medieval Iberian Romance. Having said that though, the dominant, perhaps most commonplace way of pronouncing this double L symbol is y in modern Spanish. There is a little bit of difference. I just want to make sure that you understand where I'm coming from here. So over time, as we've seen, some of these Latin initial consonant clusters undergo the secondary articulation. Clavis becomes chiaves and then entirely assimilates towards llaves. Now, the question, however, remains, why this weird disambiguation in modern Spanish? For example, why do we still have blanco? Why do we still have claro? Why isn't claro llaro? Why isn't flor llor? What's going on here? Why is there this strange kind of discrimination between some forms and others? And that still remains in part a mystery, I must confess. But from the resources I've consulted, there seem to be at least a few potential explanations for this. The first is pretty simple, and it's sociological. Words that were more commonly used tended to undergo the secondary palatal articulation and then ultimate assimilation much faster, much more consistently. So, for example, a noun like clavis for keys was much more commonplace, was much more commonly used than an adjective like claros. And for that reason, clavis becomes llave because it was just much more commonly used than claros, which remains claro in Spanish. Another interesting argument that I've come across is that some of these forms that were more conservative actually resulted from the fact that they had less simple morphological changes going on. So if you look at something like the noun flos in Latin, yes, it's flos in the nominative singular, but if you look at a lot of the other noun forms, they're a little bit more complex. They would be something like florem, floralis, flores. Because they changed so much, that led speakers to conserve the initial consonant cluster. Exactly how that works isn't clear to me. However, there might be another interesting explanation, not mutually exclusive here, but it's to do with stress. Now, some authors that I've consulted have claimed that one of the reasons that we see flos remains flor in Spanish, it keeps the initial consonant cluster, but something like flamma becomes llama, is that the stress in llama is actually more directed towards the geminated consonant. Flamma has this double M, this M that's meant to be hurled in some sense, and for that reason, the stress focuses on this part of the word and makes it a little bit easier for the earlier part of the word to change. So flamma becomes llama. Meanwhile, flos doesn't have as clear a sort of preference towards the latter half of the noun. And for that reason, the stress is more equally distributed, and then consequently, the initial consonant cluster is a bit more conservative. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that we're dealing with changes that are so far back in the past and not really very clearly attested or commented upon by contemporary grammarians. So we are at a bit of a bind, but I think that some of the features that we've looked at here might sort of explain this strange kind of bipolar approach in modern Spanish towards these initial consonant clusters. Nonetheless, you may actually have some pretty good arguments for that in the comments, so I'm very keen to learn from you and hear from you down below. Do you have any explanation better than the explanations that I've offered as to why some of these consonant clusters are preserved in some words and then they're lost in others in Spanish? If you do, please comment those down below. For now, I'm going to say thank you very much for watching. I'm very keen to hear what you have to say, and I hope to see you in the comments and in the next video. Adios.